So, welcome to the next edition of the Rare Business Podcast. With me today, I have David Moody, who is a public sector expert, and Ryan Hollenbeck, who is a customer experience guru, no less, from Verint. Hi, David. Hi, Ryan. How are you doing?
Good.
Hi, Adrian. Pleasure to meet you and speak to you today.
You're very welcome. Now, David and Ryan, for the benefit of our listeners and readers, can you tell us a little bit about about you, and also about the work that you do?
Yep, sure. Maybe I'll kick it off there, David. I mean, it's really pretty simple for me. As you said, Adrian, around customer experience, so as the executive sponsor of our customer experience program for Verint, that really means that I spend most of my time with customers, both in terms of surveying them and interacting with them, but also the big global engaged customer events that we do and a number of other activities where we get a chance to listen to and act on what our customers think.
Excellent.
And I spend most of my time with government customers of ours, and I focus on helping them help their citizens engage with them better, and vice versa.
Okay.
And I suppose one of the interesting things I think is relevant to this call is our podcast is that most of our customers and government in general are focusing on, they're all doing customer access strategies of some description, but they all include a flavor of digital, and we help them do.
Excellent. Now, I know that we were talking and prior to this and in the setup of this call, and one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was this idea that you've released a new report called Overcoming the Barriers to Successful Digital First Strategies, a Government and Public Sector Guide, David, that you sort of alluded to. Now, I don't talk enough. In fact, I don't really talk very much at all about citizen experience. So, and that's kind of a bit of a gap, and it's slightly remiss of me, I know that. So, but can you fill me in on what you see are the key challenges to governments and or public sector institutions in this sort of like space, the whole citizen experience space, and what they can do about it?
Sorry, do you want to kick off first, and then I'll...
Yeah, I mean, what really I was going to just clarify is that we do help both private and public sector organizations and speak to both of them. And I think you're right, Adrian, in asking, specifically about, what are some of the challenges that we see here? And as you said, David has written, some interesting reports around the barriers for these digital first strategies in the public sector. And so, David, let me turn it to you.
Yeah, so there's quite a breadth of things I cover in that white paper. I suppose one of the things that I would have talked about a lot more, say, 5 years ago, was that there's quite a lot of resistance to doing anything digital.
Right.
You would have an argument would have been given was, look, there's a large part of my demographic in my city or my area, my jurisdiction, that will not work digitally. Mm-hmm. There's been a big change in that excuse or reason not to do anything in recent years because they can't afford to ignore it anymore. But then if I kind of flip it and look at the other extreme, despite everyone now agreeing that they need to do something, and they're all doing something, everyone will see, and I see this myself, no one is close to the kind of experiences that we all as consumers enjoy and expect with online retailers. So there's still a big gap. Okay,
I mean, and so you mentioned something there about this sort of the consumer sort of experience, or the customer, the B2C experience. I mean, is that a key area that's applying pressure to governments and public sector institutions? It's like, because it's all about people's expectations are getting set in the consumer domain, and then therefore transferring over into a government and public sector domain.
It's a good question, Adrian, and one that David and I speak a lot about, actually, because we have customers in both, as we said, private and public sector. And I think there is a higher expectation that we're seeing in both, both amongst consumers and organizations as they try to find better ways to serve customers. And then I think importantly, as we're saying here, to better serve citizens. Right, David?
Yeah, we are all, that's why I say we're all both citizens and consumers. And it never ceases to amaze me how we can be involved in conversations where we almost think of them as two completely different people. They're not. They're the same people, and therefore they absolutely have the same expectations, and that's the challenge.
And so,
sorry, and opportunity as well, and opportunity, I should say.
well, I mean, of course, I mean, but I guess if we can take that opportunity, but then there seems to be a deficit in terms of responding to the opportunity. I mean, so what do you think are some of the big barriers that many of these, government, public sector institutions are kind of facing? What is it they have to kind of get over? I mean, is it money? Is it budget? Is it outlook? Is it strategy? Is it all of the above? I mean, or is it something in particular?
Well, we know budget's a big issue, right, David? I mean, it's a huge one, and we've talked about it in multiple different areas where we serve our customers all over the world, but I know particularly in the UK, isn't it?
It is indeed, and I think, as you say, it is global too. But the UK, I mean, Adrian, you'll know yourself, it's very acute right now, and that's definitely an issue. I think another issue, though, is there's something about I call it digital maturity, and
right.
I wrote a blog on it a few years ago, the 4 steps to digital nirvana. And there's almost like you have to all learn and take steps towards what we think is the right answer and make some mistakes and then, and learn from those things. So one example, or the most obvious example I would say is this. Quite a lot of government organizations initially said, let's just put stuff online and it will be okay.
Right.
Build the field and they will come.
Right.
And of course, that didn't happen. There's a lot more to it than just putting things online. There's a whole cultural, people, process, transformation that needs to take place to get the real savings. And those savings can be quite dramatic. So you'll often hear people talk about, and we do this as well, we talk about the price per interaction. Well, actually, the price per interaction and therefore the potential saving of a web transaction versus a call is missing the bigger picture. The savings are much bigger than that when you look at the whole end-to-end piece.
Right.
But then it becomes a bigger challenge, a bigger thing to swallow and take on.
I mean, is it just kind of stepping back and taking that kind of whole picture and sort of playing the long game, or is there a skills deficit kind of there as kind of well? Or, I mean, I'm curious to get under the skin of why we're not getting as much traction as we would like in this sort of space.
Yeah, I think, David, as you said, budgets is a big part of it, but it doesn't stop there, does it? I mean, the digital, one of the challenges that a lot of our customers tell us when we speak to them, Adrian, is that it's not only just the budgets, but it's also a bit of a prioritization exercise. And David mentioned digital, for example. I mean, to be fair, most of us do want to interact directly and find what it is that we need through self-service channels, don't we? So it's not as if government and public sector don't understand that. I think it just becomes a prioritization exercise, isn't it, David?
It is, and think about it this way, Adrian. You think about all the back office departments and all the government organisations, and they've been doing things a certain way for 50 years, and they need to change because those processes have been based around manual rekeying, contact centres that are baked in, and it's how those people have behaved their entire lives. And then some digital gurus come along and say, you know what, we can do better.
Yeah.
And guess what reaction they get?
Yeah.
So that's why the cultural change management piece is a big part of this and getting those changes in place. And again, as I said at the very beginning, there is still just some genuine resistance to doing anything at all. So that's always a part of this too.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing that kind of, because I'm thinking about this, and I know we talked about it before, and because a lot of this stuff has come into, I mean, how, not just the digital piece, but how, government and public sector respond to citizen needs and things. And this has come into sharp contrast over the last few months, particularly here in the UK, what with, the terrorist attacks in kind of Manchester and in London and things, and also more recently in the Grenfell Tower kind of tragedy. I mean, is there stuff that we can? I mean, I don't want to really dwell into this because I don't want it to be so dark, as it were. But is there stuff that we can learn from that, and stuff that we can kind of? Is that going to be an impetus to kind of do things kind of differently and better? And can we use? I mean, because it's. Forgive me, but I struggle kind of with using those type of events as a way of trying to draw other sort of lessons. But I mean, there must be something that we can learn going forward in terms of how we can use some of these kind of tools and things to provide better experience and also respond better when we have disasters.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can do better, and I think there are some things we can learn there, Adrian. And granted, it's a difficult, very difficult question to answer, really. And I think first we would want to express our sympathies to everyone involved in some of the recent incidents that you just mentioned, and including the tower tragedy, of course. But I think there are things we can learn and things we can do to better prepare. Uh-huh. And one of the things that we talk a lot about with customers is planning and getting out ahead of planning for some of these events, right?
Yeah.
To add to that, Adrian, I mean, one thing I observe just globally with the way we see things being procured, in North America, generally speaking, they think about disaster planning a lot more than they do in the UK.
Right.
A lot of the tenders we respond to and our customers, they are using our solutions and other solutions as well. In fact, in advance, they do it proactively.
Yeah.
If I give you just a couple of examples, we have one of our customers in the mid part of America, which has lots of snow.
Right.
In fact, snow's part of it, but you know yourself over in the UK, we get a bad snowstorm once every 20, 30 years. How do you plan for that? What kind of money do you put into that? The flooding we had a few years ago in the UK, Adrian, you remember?
Yeah.
How do you, and all the politics went around that. The big question is, how much do you invest for something that might happen every 30 years or not at all?
Sure.
But nevertheless, even asking the question, what would we do, allows you to think proactively and then take it from there. So another example of a city in the States, there was a bridge collapse. This was about 8-9 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it was one of our, using our software, but they used that to manage through the bridge collapse. I remember them showing a video of exactly what they did minute by minute, hour by hour after the bridge collapsed, and just been able to, it was all about people at the end of the day, but technology had to play its part.
Yes.
And as I said, and they used it successfully to add new, knowledge content, so that all the questions coming in about, where to go and what should you do in the event of, and someone was missing, and being able to raise cases, to report missing people, all of that stuff, it just happened really quickly. Mm-hmm. And they had the wherewithal to do that in place, the technology in place to do that, just simply because they were proactively thinking about disasters of any type. Now, they could never have foreseen a bridge collapse.
Sure.
But they did. This particular city had snow every year, really bad. So maybe they were thinking about it on that perspective, but they were able to then better react when a bridge collapsed. And there's lots of examples like that. On the West Coast, for example, they think about earthquakes. On the East Coast, they think about flooding, particularly in the South. Those are the kind of things, and therefore, again, in North America, we see a lot of that proactive thinking. I just haven't seen that to the same extent in the UK, and I guess that's going to change now. But maybe this is the right time to think about that.
Yeah, no, because it strikes me because, there was the kind of, you'll recall recently there was the United Airlines incident with Dr. Dow getting hauled off a plane and so on and so forth. And that was just appalling. But it's interesting because I wrote something about it after I had my own experience with overbooking, and I was coming back from Amsterdam, and then I got the note saying, we've overbooked, you can't fly, so on and so forth. And it was frustrating, and it made me gave me a visceral sort of experience around what it's like. But the thing that I realized was that actually we only understand how good our service really is when we think about the extremities of things. And maybe that's the lesson. David, you talk about kind of planning, and I mean, I used to work for Shell years and years ago, and Shell has this thing about scenario planning where they look into the future. I mean, seems to be an essential thing that government, public sector institutions have to pick up, because that's kind of when, I guess, your true character kind of shows up, when you've prepared for those type of eventualities.
Yeah, I think that's right, Adrian. As you said, preparing for those eventualities, and David and I were running through some examples of our customers. It's interesting that you brought in the private sector in the airline industry there, because I think it's a perfect example where we're all getting a bit frustrated at times, and our expectations are higher than ever. And with the way we are with social media and everything else nowadays, you better be prepared, right? I think in terms of how you want to respond to an organization. And I think it's also part of where it can get tricky with empowering the workforce, because an important part of delivering a better customer experience is having empowered workforce who, people that work for you who can actually, they're knowledgeable, they're productive, they understand, they're motivated, and they can really help the customer. And it sort of is about delighting the customer these days, isn't it? But if you're empowered in the opposite direction and you take things in a more aggressive manner with a customer, it can really go south on you in a hurry.
Yeah. So I tell you what, gentlemen, let's kind of like switch tack a little bit, because it can't all be bad, right? And surely, you've written this report and you do a lot of work, around the place with, big governments, big, local authorities, public sector institutions. I mean, there must be some really good examples of people that are delivering great sort of citizen experience, but doing it in a way, that public sector doesn't have, tons and tons of funds, but they must be doing really smart, creative, innovative sort of stuff to deliver the services that their citizens going to want. So it'd be really fascinating if you could share some examples of what they're doing and how they've come about that, and kind of what the sort of benefits that they're seeing kind of that coming out the back of it.
Yeah, I mean, one example, Adrian, quickly that I can cite is related to citizen experience. We don't really think about it. In the private sector, of course, we're used to getting customer experience surveys and listening to and talking about the voice of the customer. Less so perhaps in the public sector, but we've seen some interesting examples of customers wanting to deploy survey software, really, an enterprise feedback management system, if you will, but tweak it a bit and apply it to the citizenry. Ask them locally, what do you think about public transportation? What do you think about how we've prioritized public investment? And encapsulate and take that survey data and then build it back into the planning cycles. So it's sort of a basic example. David's got some better ones, but I think it's one that we're starting to see as a bit of a trend at the moment.
Cool.
Yeah, and I think, lots of examples. But let's start with one at home, or maybe, we'll see how long you got. But one at home, I probably can name this one as well, because we did a case study on them. It's North Lanarkshire,
right,
in Scotland.
Yay,
and Scotland in general, Scotland in general, doing some really cool things. But North Lanarkshire, let's take them as an example. You can today, as a citizen, you can register for an account, a Scottish account, and you can log in to North Lanarkshire's portal. You can check your council tax. You can raise issues. It'll all be linked against your account. You can then go to your health account using the same account,
right, and
access your health information. Then you can go to another council. Let's say you live in North Lanarkshire, but you travel to work at Moray Council.
Right.
So you can go into that portal, log in with the same account, and transact with Moray Council securely.
Okay.
Now, to me, that is phenomenal. That is what digital interactions should be like.
Yes.
And actually, I would also say it's probably one of the most advanced examples in the world today.
Wow.
In the Kingdom. And it's in Scotland.
Excellent.
And they've been doing some other incredible things. That's just scratching the surface. But that idea of a single account, without going into all the details, in England we're still struggling to get an answer to that for local government.
Right.
But in Scotland they have it nailed for both local and national in Scotland today, and it's been live now for some time. So that's just one example, and there are other ones as well.
So on that one, David, is the so how did that initially kind of come about? Because that sounds like it's taken quite a lot of open talking and collaboration to get that to work.
That is a really good question. I'm not sure what the right answer is. I think part of it is this whole idea of a national account happened on its own. And that's been happening over a period of time. And it's been, there's an interesting discussion to be had about why that was successful and it's live when the English one is not, the gov.verify one. This is for local government, and I don't know the answers, but I can certainly speculate. I'm not going to do it on this podcast.
Okay.
But that's one of the key enablers. And there's something about having a will, having executive leadership that had the motivation to want to do this, to have health, transportation, that is phenomenal, and they've achieved that. And then you've got these councils don't have a lot of money. So having to be innovative, be creative, there's a lot of that going on as well. And I think those are two of the key elements. And there's other elements too. There's a local desire as well, I think, in those examples too, that certainly play a part.
And is it, when you talk about this, it's not all about digital, or kind of, is it? I mean, because it seems to be there's this a lot of focus. I mean, particularly in the UK central government, there's a lot of focus on kind of digital. Is that because it's just we're playing kind of catch up, or is it that people are actually starting to build a balanced sort of experience, or is there not a danger that we end up going all the way down the digital route and forget about other kind of things? Or can you give me an example of an instance where somebody's got a balance kind of right, and how the balance has helped?
Go ahead, David, on that one. Yeah.
Well, actually, what you just described is another barrier where
Right. Okay.
People have thought that digital was the answer, and it was the answer to all, the silver bullet for all issues, and it's absolutely not. The reality is we still have people who want to engage with phone, or even step back from that. We all want to use a telephone. I often say when I want to complain to somebody, I want to shout at them on the end of the phone.
Yes.
If I want to request a service, I want to do that online myself. If it's a bank, for example, I want to check my balance online, but if they send charge me something for an overdrawn fee or a late payment, I want to ring them and talk to them, and maybe shout at them as well. So we've got lots of different personas or parts to our personality that make us want to use different channels, a breadth of channels. And then of course we have the demographics who I often talk about my mum and my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law will never use the internet.
Yes.
But she'll ask me to use it for her. My mother, she will.
Right.
She uses Facebook, and ever since the day she used that, I have to be very careful what I post. It's more complex than that. So you got to look after everybody. You've got to recognize that everybody has different needs at different points in time. But anyway, the last piece of that, which I mentioned earlier, is the digital piece is only the beginning. It's the whole end-to-end. All these processes, these back office processes, have been designed over 10, 15, 20 plus years to work with a telephone at the other end. Mm-hmm. They now need to be updated so that whenever someone's coming online and asking for an update, it's a real update, because if it's not up to date, then they're going to ring anyway.
Right.
And that's where the real savings are when you do it, when you integrate end to end.
Okay. And
one of the things we found too, Adrian, just as a quick add-on to that, is that with a bit of research that we had done, is that and it's quite obvious, but the research bears it out quite clearly, is that the more complex an interaction, a loan processing interaction or something like that, the greater the need for a human interaction. It's not, to your point, it's not going away, especially not for more complex interactions.
Sure.
Our research would show that you definitely most everyone would prefer to go self-service first.
Yes.
But there are certain things that are just too complex for that. And when that, that sort of demarcation switches over from simple to more complex is when it's always going to be a requirement to speak to someone. And many people, like in David's example, prefer it.
Yeah. And so the other thing that kind of think about as well is that, David, you were talking about this kind of one account thing, and that sort of makes me think about, this the rising importance and sort of concern around, the use of data and personalization. I mean, we've just recently seen in the news, was it Google's DeepMind and a couple of NHS trusts getting their knuckles rapped by the Information Commissioner's Office here in the UK about use of, anonymized kind of public health kind of data or patient data. I mean, that's a big deal. I mean, how are people kind of dealing with that sort of issue? Because that's something that's it's kind of rising. It's coming up on the rail, but it's people are getting tripped up about it. But it's going to get more and more complex, particularly with things like kind of GDPR and all that sort of stuff kind of coming in. I mean, who have you seen that's getting that sort of data and personalization sort of thing kind of right in this sort of space?
Well, I was just going to say, David, why don't you jump in? But, one of the things that you and I have chatted about a couple of times on this issue in particular, especially as it relates to things like GDPR, is what are we going to, the best organizations are really thinking proactively about how to allow consumers and citizens to opt into things as opposed to pushing things towards them directly.
Yeah, but my answer is going to be, you expect me to answer that in 3 sentences?
Right.
That's a big question. It's a big question. Look, I think the opt-in piece that Ryan's talking about, I mean, the Canadians have been doing that for years, and the UK is actually the European Commission are catching up on that, which I think is important. And there's, I think that's probably in the grand scheme of your question, that's probably the easier answer. It's quite complex, but it's the easier one. The bigger one is about this exchange of data and what customers or citizens feel comfortable giving to government and or government holding on their behalf. And I think it's a really interesting one. I think from my perspective, when I'm presenting to customers the benefits of personalization, which is part of what you talked about as well. For personalization to work, you need to know something about the citizen or the customer. And name me a citizen or a consumer who wants to give government any information about themselves. Not that many, right? So there's something about engendering trust, where if you say, you give me this information, then I will give you something in return.
Yes.
So if you tell me if you let me play with your address, then I can, and some details about your demographics, then I can start to suggest information or services that might be relevant to you, maybe even some benefits that might be relevant to you that you're not currently, benefiting from. And it's that type of piece, and not just giving the information, but being able to take it back if you're not happy with government having it any longer. So that's something we're taking a leaf out of the commercial sector book about profiles and so on, but adding to that this idea of opting in, opting out, as Ryan says, but also being able to withdraw certain parts of your profile if you no longer feel comfortable. And I think that's the area that's a big barrier to personalization becoming a reality in government. But I think again, the opportunity is there. Imagine when you go to a website that you don't have to go looking for information. It finds you. Or you don't have to look for services. It finds you because it knows who you are. I'll give you one final example. I always give this one. What if cities would allow citizens to log in with their Facebook account?
Right.
Now, normally when I say that, I get a lot of groans and how dare you. But actually, when I wanted to leave my bin out, or garbage for American listeners, when I want to know what, because we've got 3 garbage cans or bins over here in the UK, I never know which one to look at to leave out. So what do? I look out my front window and see what my neighbours are doing. Yeah. And if they get it wrong, I get it wrong. But what happens if I just went into my Facebook page, which I have open every single day, and it says there, tomorrow is a green bin day or a brown bin day? Right. Is that not offering value to me? Yes, it is. And for that to happen, I've told you how to do it. It's very simple. But one of the barriers is you can't do that because, well, actually, maybe you can. And I am starting to see some movement on that particular issue. Okay.
I mean, surely there's a bit that comes right at the front end, and you alluded to this idea about trust and the exchange of information, and I guess the provision of kind of value in many ways is that we have to sort of almost like start a conversation with people about what we want and why we want it. And that's not necessarily happening. I don't see that happening very often. Whether even in the private sector, never mind the sort of public sector or government. And do you not think that that's a missing kind of piece? That starting that, having that initial conversation and putting it to people, saying, "This is what we want, and this is why, and this is what you're going to get for it."
Yeah, you've got to earn citizen trust, and same in the private sector. People don't just want to be told, do they? Here's what you're going to go do next, and that sort of thing. I do think you're right in saying, Adrian, that both citizens, and consumers, as David said, we're all both. So, we want our voices to be heard, and we want to have the opportunity to speak up and have that be part of what ultimately happens along the way, not just get told what to do. Right?
Okay. And so, gentlemen, if I said to you, we've got a government or private sector kind of leader that's listening into this kind of podcast, or it gets kind of like shared with them and so on and so forth, and they say, right, fine, we would like to, up our game on the provision of improving our citizen experience and using all these kind of digital kind of tools and technologies and platforms and stuff. But they're like going, that's a big old job. Where would you, given your experience, recommend that they start? I mean, because it's all about momentum in many cases.
You've got to start with a plan. I think, and I think, as you just said, Adrian, it's got to be a plan that involves the citizenry themselves as part of setting up the right types of objectives. I mean, we've seen that in our best examples, right, David?
Yeah, I think there's maybe two key answers to that. One is agile working,
Right.
where you're not looking at multi-year programs. You're looking at something very short, sweet, that can deliver value. And then once you deliver it, you can point to it and say, I delivered that, and it's delivering value. Give me some more money.
Right.
And I'm saying it very, very simplistically, but actually that is what it boils down to. And what are the examples of the best example of something you can point to? It's a portal. Because if you have a portal, you can say to people, you can now log into that, and you can now get access to your services, and that becomes the beginning of a platform of a whole bunch of services you can deliver incrementally with more funding. So I think that's the most obvious thing, and that's what I tell our customers is don't think big bang. Start simply with something very visual that your politicians can literally go in front of a camera and say, look at what I've done. It's that simple.
Excellent. And so, gentlemen, I mean, I've got a couple of final questions that I want to ask that I always ask at the end of these interviews, but talking about your sort of experience, particularly in government and public sector, and also the report that you released. I mean, is there anything else that you'd like to add that we've missed out before I ask these kind of two final questions?
Well, I'm sure there's a few things, David, from the research that we'd want to add in. I mean, one thing that we didn't talk about in detail, we touched on it just a bit, Adrian, it might be worth noting, is just some of the other emergency services and sort of forensically being able to figure out what's happening in the public sector in order to make the world a safer place. And,
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of overlap here where we see discussions around responding quickly to emergency services and being able to go back and look through what actually happened in a certain incident so that we can not only focus on the citizen engagement part of it and making it more pleasant, but also continuing to make it as safe as possible for citizens.
Yeah.
And the other example I'll add to that, just because it seems to be stuff that we're working on at the moment, and I'm personally excited about the potential, is this whole idea of bots,
Right.
but specifically in the area of Amazon Alexa and Google Home. The idea that government services can be literally sitting on your kitchen table, and you can ask it questions and you can ask it for updates. Effectively, it becomes another portal, one that has essentially access to the same information and same services that you would have via a web browser, but actually through a device that you can talk to.
Right.
And I think that's really interesting and offers other options and opportunities for government across the world.
Fantastic. That's really interesting. So, gentlemen, it brings me to my two final kind of questions. And the first one is a slightly selfish one, but it's my piece of ongoing research, if you like. And it's related to the fact that I published a book last year called How to Wow. And ever since it was being published on these interviews, I've been asking different people for what their perspective is on what is wow service or experience to you. And so I'd be really interested to get your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it's really just the unexpected, isn't it? I mean, my wife and I had a chance to do a bicycle tour through Normandy a few years ago, and we expected certain things about it. But one of the things that we did not expect is to have a Garmin device, a GPS system loaded on the bike so that we could just go through the whole thing at our own pace. And I remember that taking us through all these wonderful little villages and markets and chateaus and the like, and never once having to worry about being lost or, where are we going next or arriving anywhere on time. I thought that was the unexpected, and it was a great example of a wow factor to the experience that really made a difference for us.
Super.
And I think for me, I had something prepared, but I've decided to change it now. So this is hot off the press. It's control.
Okay.
Giving citizens control of their experience. And that goes back to this idea of trust, and which also goes back to the idea of personalization. Empower the citizen to take some control over their dealings with government, and then they get the extra value as a result. And then having that control always, so that if they feel, you know what, I want to maybe take some of that information back, that they can do that. Mm-hmm. I think so. Control. I'd written down personalization, but I think control is probably stronger and does address this issue of trust, which I think needs to be addressed.
Excellent. And so that brings me to my final question, gentlemen, that I always ask at the end of these podcasts. And the question is this: is there anything that you would like to shamelessly plug?
Well, I don't know about shamelessly, Adrian, but I think as it relates to your last question about WOW, I mean, we've Verint's known as helping a lot of private and public sector organizations make sense of all this really massive amounts of information that they have and really turn it into some kind of data or actionable intelligence so that they can anticipate, respond, and take action, as you'd expect, really. But we do it in those two markets, customer engagement and cyber intelligence. And I think as we go forward here for us, we want to be able to help in some of the dialogue and discussion that we've talked about today, both in terms of the public sector engaging more effectively, but also making it a safer place.
Perfect. David, you want to embellish on that or add anything of your own?
What he said.
Brilliant.
Oh dear.
That's brilliant. I've never had that one before. I've done more than 200 of these, and I've never had what he said as kind of the last word.
Well, you see, I could, if you asked me a question like that, I would talk for half an hour. So it's either what he said or a longer answer.
Well, gentlemen, let me just kind of say thank you so much for your time and your experience today. I mean, I think I would encourage people to look at the white paper, which I'll link to in the blog post, but the white paper called Overcoming the Barriers to Successful Digital First Strategies, a Government Public Sector Guide, because there's some really good stuff in there. There's a lot of work that's gone into it. I think there's a huge amount of work that needs to get done in the public sector around improving the citizen experience and improving sort of, giving people the tools and the help that they need kind of when they need them, and particularly in times of emergency, because that's when it really kind of counts. But so I'll make sure I get all that linked up and give that all a big kind of shout out. But I just wanted to say thank you so much, David and Ryan, for your time and sharing your experience today. That's been great.
Thank you, Adrian.